take it as a way of learning. We all have something amazing to bring to the table. And if you just have a small icebreaker where you can learn from that individual and they can learn from you, the rest of the conversation flows smoothly as well as seamlessly.
Most hosts never achieve the results they hoped for. They're falling short on listenership and monetization, meaning their message isn't being heard and their show ends up costing them money. This podcast was created to help you grow your listenership and make money while you're at it. Get ready to take notes. Here's your host, Adam Adams.
Welcome back to the podcast on podcasting. And I'm your host, Adam, AAA Adams, joined with Miss Genesis Amaris Kemp. How are you, Genesis?
I'm doing well, Adam. Thank you for having me on your platform.
Well, it's reciprocated. We just recently had an episode on yours as well. And what I think is interesting that you are doing that not everybody else dares to do, I think most of us are even afraid of maybe even publishing one episode a week. Some people, like we have worked with a lot of people that are starting a podcast, and some of them want to do like bi-weekly, every other week. And others are like, oh, I'm going to go every single week. Like it's a really big deal, right? To publish every week. And so I know that it's not just the people that are coming to us that are thinking that. It's probably a couple of people that are listening are there as well. But with your podcast, you've been pushing out quite a bit of content the last year since you published. In fact, you're approaching the 200 episode mark as this one's being released. You're like right there, and all within about a year. It's crazy. And I don't think that most of us can wrap our heads around that level of content. So I'm excited to get into your story and find out how come you do things the way that you do. Your bio, it's in the show notes. So for our listener, like if you just want to check out the bio, just simply scroll down. The podcast name is Gems with Genesis Amaris Kemp. And we'll actually link to that as well. Plus the episode where I was on her podcast. She does a little bit of YouTube. She also does the typical platforms like Apple, Spotify, those types of things that you'll probably be doing as well. And she's got this R-cubed method that we will be discussing. And I'm going to pick her brain quite a bit on like just learning how to be more individual about our podcast and not just feeling like we need to copy other people that are gone before. Get a little bit more of her like pros and cons of podcasting, like what's stressful about it, what's holding her back, and what are the benefits? What is she really getting out of having it? And go a little bit about how it's fitting into her business, if it is at all. So let's jump into there with Genesis Amaris Kemp right now. Genesis, what is this R-cubed method? What does it mean? Where do you use it? I'm really curious because it seems like something that could also benefit all podcasters by using the R-cubed method. So share a little bit about that.
So my R-cubed method, it stands for refuel, refocus, and realign. I came up with this method whenever I wrote my book, Chocolate Drop in Corporate America, From the Pit to the Palace, after dealing with systemic racism, working in the oil and gas and energy sector for 12 years, being in oil and gas that long, you're privy to seeing some things that are not necessarily conducive to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And it takes you back, especially if your organization is talking about all this stuff that they're doing in DE&I, but then you're not really seeing it evident. And so as I was writing, that's whenever the idea downloaded inside me. I was like, oh my gosh, this RQ method would help so much people, whether you're in corporate, whether you're in the healthcare, or et cetera. And then I started to partner that with podcasting. And the reason why I partnered it with podcasting is because you have to refuel yourself, just like you take the time to refuel your vehicle. If you don't put gas in your car is not going to run. Or if you don't take time to refuel who you are, you're going to hit that brick wall, and that brick wall is going to be burnt out because you're not going to be conducive to yourself, let alone somebody else. Refocus, and I'm just giving these in a high level format. Refocus is the ability to kind of take what you know, take a step back, and really ask yourself, is this the area that I want to glow and grow in? Because sometimes we allow social media, we allow our family members, our friends, and everyone else to start programming us whenever that programming may not be conducive to where we're trying to go. So whenever you're refocusing, you have to take that time to deprogram yourself in order to keep your software, which is your mental health, your spiritual health, your physical health, and etc., maintained, if that makes sense. Then realign. Analogy that I like to use here is whenever you go get your vehicle service and you go get an oil change, they change your oil. Then afterwards they say, "Sir, madam, have you thought about rotating and balancing your tires?" And the reason why they ask you that is because if you don't rotate and balance your tire after your oil change, your car is not going to be driving in proper alignment. It may pull too far to the left or too far to the right. And that's just how we can be sometimes as human beings. Whenever we don't know what we're doing, we can easily lose track of the end goal at sight or the flag at the end of the finish race because we're being pulled too far to the left and too far to the right. So we have to stop and take time to realign ourselves, maintain that homeostasis, regain that balance, and know that we are traveling at the same wavelength that we have created for ourselves, and not what other people have tried to, placed on us, or whether it's negative Nancy or limitations or etc., if that makes sense. So whenever you think about refuel, refocus, and realign, you could use the RQ method in your personal as well as your professional life.
How about with you, one way with your podcast specifically, do you refuel either before a podcast interview, after a podcast interview, when deciding what content to do, editing the podcast, whatever it is? What's one way that you refuel specific to your podcast?
So sometimes I'll get up, I'll go for a walk, or like on Tuesdays and Thursdays, I have a set time to go work out. And so that pulls me away from my podcasting journey because I have to condition my body, not just mentally, but physically, because if I don't condition myself physically, I'm not going to be good mentally. So working out is a way that I refuel, especially for my podcast, because I'm getting all that excessive junk out and putting in something that is helping me. Another thing I like to do is journal. Whenever I am journaling, I'm writing down different thoughts that come into my head. And then I use that as a mind mapping session to really curate what topics that I want to have on my podcast, whether it's me doing solo episodes or if it's me contacting an SME, which is a subject matter expert, to come on my platform and talk about that topic. So those are two things that I currently do to refuel.
How about refocus, and particular to the podcast?
Refocus for the podcast. So whenever I'm looking at the content that I currently have up, I go down of all my episodes that I currently have, and then I say, okay, I don't want the same topic back to back. So that allows me to refocus on what I'm going to put up next, because if everything sounds the same, there's no individuality. Everything is going to be kind of like robotic. So I also take that time to just really plug in and ask myself, okay, I see that I had this topic with this person and etc. So maybe I need to switch it up. Another thing that I really take into consideration, refocus on, is DE&I with my podcast, because if I've had a lot of Caucasian people.
What is DE&I?
Oh, diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Okay. Got it.
Sorry. I came from a world of acronyms, being in corporate for so long. So another thing that I do to refocus is I like to make sure I have diversity in my podcast. So depending on who I've had on for a certain number of time, if that person was Caucasian, if that person was Hispanic, I try to switch it up so you don't see all of one race, but you see a mixed variety of racial groups that are all bringing something to the table that can add value to the listeners.
Yeah. Okay. Got it. And yeah, it does. And with that, is it diversity just with like race, or is it like gender and other things like that too?
I factor in everything, because diversity is not just race, it's not just gender, it's not just religion, but everything as a whole. And I feel like whenever you don't see diversity as a whole, then you're missing a big population.
So is it important for us or for our listener when they're creating a podcast, is it something that we ought to be conscious of making sure that the podcast is diverse. For example, I come from the real estate space, and randomly enough, at least 2 years ago, maybe less so now, when I go to like a real estate like event, it was like everybody that was on stage was older. This is like 50 plus, which isn't that old. Obviously, if you're listening and you're 50, I'm not calling you old, darn it. But older, they're more mature, they were white, and they were men, like older white men. It was just a whole bunch of gray hair and white skin on the stage, or bald hair, maybe. There was some diversity. Some had gray, some had bald. But the point being that, like, when I started hosting real estate events in the past, I was like, all right, we're going to try to get like a big variety. Yeah, because I knew that a lot of people, they don't want to just see that. And if we're talking like you're a Black woman, and I know that when I was going to real estate events, there's a lot of times like Black women who specifically said, how am I supposed to even know if I can do this? Like everyone on stage, none of them look like me or anything, the complete opposite or whatever. So how am I even supposed to know, like, if I can do this? And I wanted to do a little bit different. Like I made sure that I had more like diverse panel and people that were inside that real estate from many different walks of life, so that anyone in the audience could say, well, I can do this because like there's a lot of people like me that also do this. For example, is it important that we're doing this on our podcast? And if so, why?
So, two-part answer. I would tell those who are interested in getting into podcasts, who is your avatar? Who are you trying to cater your podcast to? What does your audience look like? How are you being the solution to their problem? Then you could reverse engineer it to see how you need to factor in diversity, equity, and inclusion, but also equality into the scenario. But if you are just setting up your podcast to factor in diversity, equity, inclusion, and equality, and that's all you see, then you may be narrowing yourself because you want to meet certain metrics, when in actuality, meeting certain metrics can also cause you to pigeonhole yourself as well. And the reason why I say that is, coming from a corporate space, I've worked in oil and gas where they wanted to meet certain metrics. So diversity, equity, and inclusion, DE&I, became a check the box. So some people felt like they were only getting slotted for certain positions because they looked a certain way or they came from a certain area, when in actuality, they may not have been the best candidate for the job, but because they needed to meet those status quos, then they were the ones who were getting tapped on their shoulder. So that's why I answered the question the way I did. And then in my stance of my podcast, Gems with Genesis Amaris Kemp, diversity, equity, and inclusion is important to me. That's part of my morals and my values, with me being an Afro-Latina and also Caribbean, because I am first generation American. My dad was from Curacao, which is off the tip of Venezuela, and my mom is West Indian. So she's from St. Vincent and the Grenadines in the West Indies. So me looking the way that I look, and also having the background that I have, people see me as a Black and brown woman, but they don't really know the layers behind me, because they just see me in one way.
Yeah, cool.
If that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. It does. There's a lot to discussion. It wasn't the reason for me having you on the podcast, and so I wasn't planning on focusing on it so much, but I think that it's really important as part of the refocus for us, regardless of like what our goals are with the podcast, to make sure that we are hitting those goals. For example, you mentioned one thing that means a lot to you. It's part of your why, is to have more diversity. And I think that it's interesting because, like, when I host events or when I'm having a podcast or whatever, I never want anyone to think, you're on my show so that I can hit this metric. For example, my mother, growing up in Utah, the business that she worked for, it was like an all Mormon book company. And they literally had to hire at least one person that was not LDS, or else they could have been like in trouble, even though it was a total LDS, like Mormon bookstore.
And what's LDS?
Latter-day Saint, Mormon. It just basically means it's another way that most of us will say Mormon. It's like the more appropriate way, the Latter-day Saint. I guess Mormons are sometimes can be offended by being called a Mormon because they read a book called the Book of Mormon. Not to make this a religious podcast at all, but the point that I was trying to make is, my mom actually felt bad in a way. She's like, I'm just the token non-Mormon. I'm just like here so that they can fulfill something. And it was like hard for her to know if she was part of the team because she's not Mormon or if she's part of the team because she's really good at her job. And I think it's an interesting topic since you brought up the diversity thing for us to know, and particularly for me to know, since I'm white and blue eyes, and it's like so obvious that I was born in the US and nobody has to think about that. I want to make sure that if I'm bringing somebody on the podcast and if they have some type of diversity, that they don't think that that's the reason why. Is there any tips that you would give me or somebody like in my same situation?
Yes. So one thing that I like to do whenever I have on people on my podcast that don't necessarily look like me is I try to take it as a way of learning, because we're all created as masterpieces. We all have something amazing to bring to the table. And if you just have like a small icebreaker where you can learn from that individual and they can learn from you, the rest of the conversation flows smoothly as well as seamlessly. But if you allow the elephant in the room to be the fact that you guys are different shades, different colors, and etc., then that may create some unwanted tension and have those nonverbal cues where that person, yes, they're on your podcast, but they may not necessarily open up as much as you would like them to open up, and they may have some type of guard up. So I always start with a icebreaker or something funny, because that is my personality. I'm very bubbly, energetic, and etc. Or if I do a pre-interview with that person, I try to ask them different questions where they could tell me more about who they are, what they like to do, and etc. Because then that allows me to build rapport with that individual. And I see them as a human being, not just a person that is different than me. Because if you think about it this way, and this will probably make sense to you, Adam, once upon a time, all of our best friends were once strangers to us, but we had the courage and the bravery to meet that individual, and we built a relationship with them, and that person then became our best friend. So whenever you have podcast guests or clients or whatever you like to refer to them as, think about it. That stranger could very well turn into a good friend if you are open-minded and receptive.
I definitely agree with that. I love that. That's really good feedback.
And remove unconscious biases.
Don't know how to do that. I would like to learn, because they're unconscious. It's like, damn it. But I want to make sure I understand what you're saying. So it sounds like you're saying, as far as like diversity goes, that the best way to make sure anyone who's on your podcast, regardless of diversity or whatever, knows that they're on your show or on your stage or whatever, isn't because they're a minority or anything else. The best way to do that, it sounds like what you're saying, please correct me if I'm wrong, is that you just don't even acknowledge it. You don't mention it. You don't pay attention to it. And that's the best way to make sure someone knows if that you're including them because of their strengths and their knowledge and their experience and not any other reason. Is that what you're saying?
Yes. And let me just add this. So whenever I reach out to people who don't necessarily look like me, I let them know, as long as you could come on the podcast and you can articulate the core pillars of GEMS, which is to educate, inspire, and motivate, then you're my type of girl or guy that I want to talk to, because we're educating others, we're inspiring them, and we're also motivating them. Because you come from a different area, I get to learn from you, to learn more about your background, about your culture, and etc. And that helps me out as an individual, because then I'm no longer allowing maybe the programming that was ingrained in me when I was growing up to affect how I am seeing that individual.
Good stuff. Appreciate you going into that. Realign. One way that you on your podcast realign.
I realign with CTAs, call to actions, because sometimes when you listen to a podcast and you hear a great segment, sometimes people fail to realize what the call to action was if they mentioned it in the beginning. So I always like to give my guests the opportunity to say what their call to action is at the end and then close us out. That way that sticks with someone, and it's a way of summing up the episode in a sense.
Can you give me an example of that?
Okay, like for you, Adam, since you were on my podcast, we talked about some amazing things. And I said, okay, Adam, so based on the 3 pillars of influence, what's your call to action that you would like to leave the listeners and viewers with? And remember, you're on GEMS, where the mission is to educate, inspire, and motivate.
Perfect. Got it. I think that's really good. And I think calls to action are important for the growth of our listener. Like, I think it's critically important. And it's interesting because I have noticed many people that say, I'm not going to have a call to action. They say, because I don't want to be doing my podcast for the wrong reasons. I want it to come from my heart. So I'm having no calls to action. And I definitely disagree with that. The call to action doesn't have to be hire my company. That's not what the call to action has to be. The call to action is, look, you got people listening and learning and being exposed to some new knowledge and new direction, and they don't know the next step. Giving a call to action is literally just helping them with the next step. Look, you've learned these things about the 3 pillars. You've learned these things about R cubed. You've learned these things about diversity. You've learned these things about whatever is, the meat of the episode. Now, here's the thing you can do. Here's your call to action. Here's how you can go to the next thing. So refuel, refocus, realign. I love with the realign how you're utilizing the call to action, because I think it's so important for us to be able to get to the next level. Or I guess the best way to say it is for our listener to take action on something. Give them a clear call to action. I also wanted to talk about individuality. When I asked you at the beginning of the pre-interview, question was, what value do you want to give to a brand new podcaster? This is the thing that came up. I'd really like you to take a couple of minutes to pour into us on what you mean by individuality.
So when you are just starting off in your podcast journey, it could be so overwhelming because you see all these incredible podcasters who are out here doing their thing that you may try to bend and break in a sense in order to kind of do what they're doing, when in actuality, you just need to do what you do best and remain authentic and have your individuality shine, because there's only one you, and each one of us was created on purpose, for a purpose, and unique. So if we tap into our uniqueness and we look at the ways that we are an individual and we put that into podcasting, then it will stand out, because there's only one person that has your voice, which is you. There's one person that has your sound, that can, read like you can, that can sing like you, that can recite poetry or etc. There's no other you. So why not be the best you? Why are you allowing what other people are doing to cause you to retreat and shrink back, when in actuality, if you just step outside of your comfort zone, if you just take that leap of faith, and if you just boss up and say, you know what? I am unique for a reason. I am an individual for a reason, and I have something valuable to add. So I tell people, what type of imprint are you leaving? How is that imprint driving impact? And how are you being the world changer that you desire to be? And that's all a part of you. And when you do the exercise to ask yourself, who am I? What makes me an individual? Then you will find the keys to unlock destiny assignments and doors when you really tap into you. And for me, when I started in my journey, yes, it was overwhelming. I started with no podcasting equipment, bought some cheap equipment on Amazon. It worked. I got on anchor.fm. The platform was free. And I started doing solo episodes where I just talked into the mic, and people gravitated to that because I was transparent. I was raw. I was real. And what led me to getting into my own podcast was the loss of my dad. And he was like my best friend. And no one really understood it. And I was tired of the bullcrap and people saying, oh, I know how you feel. When in actuality, you don't know how I feel because you still have your dad that you could talk to. You still have your mother. So it was a way for me to cope. And while I was coping and going through the grief journey, I didn't know how my stories would help somebody else. Then after I did X amount of solo episodes, I started to, open my perspective. And I said, there's so much people in the world who have incredible stories, but they may never have the chance to share their story. So why not reach out to those people and see if they want to be on my podcast? If they respond, cool beans. If not, then it just means that it wasn't meant to be, or maybe later on down the line, they'll hop on and be a guest. And that's what I started to do. So now I have a mix of solo episodes and interview style episodes. And I wanted to keep it where it didn't feel like it was a rehearsal. So my podcast is conversational style. I don't send questions beforehand. I really in the present with that individual, and I ask them questions based on what they're reciting. And Adam could tell you because he was on my podcast, and I'm not sure if my podcast was like any other ones that he's been on. And I just asked him questions that was led on my heart to ask him because I truly wanted to know more about Adams, AAA. And I really wanted to know, so what's the 3 pillars of influence and et cetera. So I could educate myself, but also leave some content to educate somebody else, because you never know how your story and your voice can change or shape someone else's life.
So that's a lot to unpack, Genesis. Like there's a ton of information. Here's some of what I'm hearing. You started your podcast around the time right after your dad's passing. And I'm so sorry to hear that. Additionally, when you have podcast episodes, you don't send questions ahead of time. And it's funny because there's so many people. I also get invited on other podcasts, and a lot of times they'll send like a significant amount of questions. Even sometimes it's like, how long do you want this episode to go? Because you just gave me like 25 questions. If you want 30-second answers, we can probably keep this episode around a half an hour. If you want me to actually answer the questions, and all 25 of these, we're going to be here for a couple of hours. I'm like, I'm sorry. It's just, you can't get the value of one question without it. For example, we're on this episode right now. How many questions have I truly asked? Basically, we're at 1.5. We talked about R cubed, and now we're in the middle of individuality, and we're at like 50 plus minutes. And so it's like, how do you even do that and actually get the value and pull out and understand? So you're intentionally being different. Like, you know that a lot of people send a bunch of questions. They want to be prepared. And you basically have drawn a line in the sand and said, that's fine. They can do it that way. But on my side of the sand line, I get to know you personally, like as if we're just at a coffee shop and getting to know each other. It's not scripted. I really appreciate that. If I'm a listener, is there like a tangible like takeaway that I can have to help me be more individual on my show so that I can stand out, so that I can have my own approach and not just be copying things that people are suggesting to me or things that I've seen done? It's tough because we have so many different, diverse like listeners from all walks of life. But is there something, Genesis, that we could maybe pour in that would apply to all of us to be more individual with our podcast?
Yeah. So ask yourself the question, what are you passionate about? And answer it. And whatever you're passionate about, you could talk about it for hours because it's natural to you. You love it and it warms your heart. Then the other thing is have fun. When I do podcasting, I just like to have fun with it. And whenever you have fun with it, it becomes natural. It's not forced. It's not like you're going to a job or etc. you're doing what you're passionate about, you're having fun. And then the other thing is, yes, if people give you feedback, what I like to tell them is thank you. Remember that feedback is a gift. You can either take what applies to you and learn from it, or if it does not apply for you, discard it and thank the person that they cared enough and put it in your back pocket in case something does come up later on where you can use that feedback. But feedback is always just going to be feedback. And if you think about it in a professional setting, at work, we get feedback. Does all of it apply to us? Yes and no. And if it doesn't, just move on, keep it moving. But remember who you are, and who you are is going to set the tone and precedent for your podcast. And you're just going to be you and have fun. And one way to draw the line in the sand is what things set you apart. And whenever you come up with that, maybe base your podcast around that. Because if it sets you apart and no one else is doing it, then you're going to be an anomaly.
Yep.
And if you like to, okay. And another tip I'll say is, because my podcast is Coffee Chat Style. So sometimes I may be drinking coffee. I'll have a blue cup. Like today I had tea. I had peppermint tea. Or other days, depending on what day it is, I may be drinking wine or whatnot. But I want you to just kind of relax. And when you are relaxed, there's no pressure that is being added onto you. So you're not having that compounded effect. Because if you're going into this with, oh, I got to do this, I got to do that, I got to stand out, you're putting additional pressure onto you, and it's no longer going to be fun.
A lot of info there. And I probably don't have the time that it will take to go into pros and cons that you've had of podcasting, or just understanding more about how it meshes with your business, or if it doesn't, just because of where we are with time. But I will like to at least recap the last thing that you said was impactful for me and helpful for me as even as a podcast coach, helping other podcasters. And I want to restate it because it was so important. When we're deciding how do we niche, how do we become different, how do we draw our line in the sand, how do we know what topic our podcast should be about? You stated that you should just simply ask yourself this one question. What are you passionate about? What is it that you care about that keeps you up at night, that gets you going in the morning? And then answer it. Ask yourself, what are you passionate about? And then answer it. And I love that second piece of advice that you said, to make sure that you're keeping individual. Just have fun with your podcast. Be yourself, enjoy yourself, and maybe even have a glass of wine, a glass of coffee, or a glass of tea, depending on the day, so that it doesn't feel like you've got a bunch of pressure. You're just kind of enjoying the conversation. And that is, I think, got you to so many episodes in such a short amount of time. So there's a lot of strength. There's a lot of truth to that question. What are you passionate about? I think all of us should ask ourselves that question before we jump in. So Genesis, the link to your website and your bio and your podcast is already in the show notes. What would you like to leave the listener with today?
I want to leave them with a quote from Babe Ruth. Never let the fear of striking out keep you from playing the game.
Boom. Drop the mic. If you're listening and you enjoyed that interview, please let us know leave an honest rating and a review so we know what your thoughts are. Also, if you have a sec, just jump on down below. You can click on Gems with Genesis Morris Kemp. You can click that link and check out her podcast. It'd be awesome and ridiculous and amazing. And I'd be happy about it if you left her an honest rating and review as well. And then last thing, but not least, on the next episode after this episode, this is our interview episode. Every other episode, just like Genesis mentioned that she does, and I love that she said that, is she does some episodes where it's just her pouring into your business. Well, that's what we do on every even numbered episode. So I'll see you here in just a few seconds. I really don't say this nearly enough. I don't mention this, and I feel horrible because it's a great resource for you to be able to take your podcast to the next level. And it's simply a free resource that I don't need your email or anything. It's just a podcasting course that I created that is ended up putting in the very first 6 episodes of this podcast. So if you haven't checked it out, definitely going to want to just check out those first 6 episodes, see how they can help you improve your podcast, get in front of more people, and have a better result where you're making more money through the podcast, etc. So much can happen after you listen through episodes 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. So if you haven't done it, go do it now. And by the way, if you're subscribed, you'll keep hearing more great content. So to those of you who are, I'll see you on the next episode.